Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm happy to join this Opposition Day motion debate on an important subject. I've long described Iran as the most destabilizing force in the world right now, standing in the way of global peace and security, and we're talking about that today and bringing the debate to the floor of the House of Commons. I'd like to thank my colleague and the Deputy Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, the member from Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, for helping advance this debate here today and being an active participant in it. I've been following and just amused by the fact that many in the Liberal Parliamentary Secretary and then even some opposition members on this side of the House keep using the word partisan. This is something the government often throws out. Stop being so partisan, as if this chamber, which is designed for opposing points of view, for debate, for speech, for challenging the government, somehow we're being partisan if we suggest parts of this debate should focus on the horrendous and tyrannical regime in Iran. In fact, there's nothing partisan in that. In fact, it's an absence of leadership, how quiet the Prime Minister has been vis-a-vis Iran, Mr. Speaker. They, I could say, are partisan when they formed government and kept using the rhetoric, Canada is back. Back to what when it comes to Iran? Back to being silent in the face of the death of a Canadian? To being silent in the face of thousands being imprisoned? In fact, in February, Alex Neve of Amnesty International confirmed thousands detained without charge in Iran. The Prime Minister was one of the few global leaders absolutely silent with respect to the protests in Iran, the democratic desire for people to have human rights, basic level of democratic rights and freedoms that we take for granted. The Prime Minister, who loves traversing the world as the global progressive, has been very silent with respect to Iran, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we're here today. And if they want to suggest we're partisan, well, thank goodness we're partisan, because one of their own members from Richmond Hill has been an apologist for the regime, Mr. Speaker, has hosted delegations from Iran in Canada, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps that's why the Prime Minister doesn't want to talk much about it. Maybe there's some debate in his caucus on how much we should engage in Iran or how much we should call out their behavior, Mr. Speaker. I should add, I forgot, I got into rhetorical flight so quickly that I'm dividing my time with my friend from Belchat-les-Châteaumens-Lévis. But, Mr. Speaker, getting back to that, the first time this Prime Minister mentioned Iran in the House of Commons, he said this in January 2016, a new Prime Minister, quote, "We know that Iran is a cause of concern," unquote. Later on, he said, global safety will be through responsible engagement. A cause for concern, Mr. Speaker. If nothing better illustrates the fact the Prime Minister has been either willfully blind with respect to the horrific conditions facing a lot of people in Iran, and the fact that he's been wanting to expand Canadian presence, negotiate aircraft sales, Mr. Speaker, shows that the Liberal government has had the wrong approach when it comes to Iran, and that's what this debate is about. And in fact, when there's a regime that is probably the most disruptive force to global peace and security, we have to be careful that our engagement with them is not normalizing that regime, Mr. Speaker. I would suggest comments suggesting that there's an elected government in Iran, that the protesters, as if it was just a regular protest for tuition fees or something, they should negotiate with their elected officials. That was irresponsible, Mr. Speaker, and the Prime Minister should condemn statements from his own caucus that will allow some Canadians to not have the proper view of a regime that is the most oppressive on this earth. And we've seen this even more in recent months, Mr. Speaker. The death of Professor Syed Amami, a Canadian citizen in Evan Prison, has eerie reminiscence of the death of photojournalist Zara Kazemi in the same prison, Mr. Speaker. Now Miriam Mombaini, who went to try and investigate the circumstances of her husband's death, he illegally detained alongside thousands in Iran, Mr. Speaker. Now it appears she cannot return home. So this is the type of regime we're dealing with. In the same time, over the last really 30 years or since the revolution of 1979, there's been an expressed desire for nuclearization of an Iranian regime, Mr. Speaker, which would put a direct threat on Israel, but a threat to global security in the Middle East and around the world, Mr. Speaker. This motion also highlights the horrific role that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard plays, not just oppressing their own people in Iran, Mr. Speaker, but around the world. They have been a direct funder and supporter of terror in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in Gaza, Mr. Speaker, in Palestinian-controlled territories, funding Hamas, funding terror, not wanting peace, security, and stability, Mr. Speaker. So condemning that should be something I would think all members of this House do, Mr. Speaker. But we're here today because of the general silence with respect to this government's position on Iran. It seems after we've pushed them that they're holding off the aircraft sale, Mr. Speaker. I guess that's a refreshing development from us pushing them on it. Boeing, Mr. Speaker, has said they will not sell any type of aircraft to the regime at a time where more and more global attention is being paid on Iran, as it should be, because the international community has to condemn the actions of the regime. Just last week, Mr. Speaker, the Supreme Leader called for genocide on the Jewish people, Mr. Speaker. They've tried to normalize their positions of hate. And we have to be very careful that in this rush, as the Prime Minister naively said in his first few months as Prime Minister, responsible engagement with the Iranian regime, that we're not somehow normalizing that regime, Mr. Speaker. I would point my friend, the parliamentary secretary who's listening to this debate, for the comments in April from Madame Shirin Ebadi, a Nobel Prize winner for her work as a human rights lawyer, Mr. Speaker, an Iranian woman championing the cause of freedom and democratic rights. What did she say in April? Quote, "Reform is useless in Iran," Ebadi told in an interview with Bloomberg. She went on to say, quote, "The Iranian people are very dissatisfied with their current government. They have reached this point and realized the system is not reformable," end quote, Mr. Speaker. So a number of the elements that we're bringing here in this debate is to showcase that and to start to demand the Liberal government to start speaking up for the people of Iran, speaking up for the families impacted, like Ms. Mumbaini, speaking up for the very principles that they talked about in Charlevoix, Mr. Speaker. It seems to be absent when it comes to Iran. And we'd also like them to correct the record fuzzied in January of this year by their own member from Richmond Hill, Mr. Speaker. At a time where the Prime Minister was silent, there was no clear direction from our Foreign Affairs Minister, this single tweet by a Liberal Member of Parliament sent a very, very bad signal. At the bare minimum, incredibly naive, Mr. Speaker, or possibly worse. And so I would like to see the government clearly renounce that view and not allow that member to host Iranian delegations in Canada. So what else would I like to see out of this Opposition Day motion now that we're shining the bright light of accountability on a government that doesn't like it? I would like to see this government apply Magnitsky sanctions against the Supreme Leader and many of the key regime functionaries, Mr. Speaker, who promote hate, support terrorism. Mr. Speaker, the Magnitsky sanctions should be applied immediately. I would like to see Iran put on the country control list. We've debated arms trade in this place, Mr. Speaker. The Liberals seem to forget they have the ability to stop all sales with regimes like Iran. Only North Korea is currently on that list. Iran should be immediately placed on the area country control list. I'd like to see Iran removed from the SWIFT financial system, Mr. Speaker. We've seen them directly fund terror operations around the world, putting people at risk, in some cases using money from the Iranian deal previously negotiated, Mr. Speaker. Access to the SWIFT system has allowed this to be moved. And I'd like a clear statement from the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. Even if they support this motion today, I would like the Prime Minister to be clear in his renunciation of the regime and sanction his member for Richmond Hill for clouding the issue with respect to whether Iranians truly get to elect their government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.